I got a call this week from a contractor who's going over to a new software program for pricing out his jobs. And that software is using gross margin per man day, not a billable labor rate. He's going, Bill, does this mean I can no longer use the software? I really want to keep using it to make sure my profitability is where it needs to be. Well, the answer is yes. And how you do it is the topic of this week's Planning for Profit Minute. Now, gross margin per man day simply takes what is the total cost of operating your business, your overhead expenses, and what's the gross margin that I need to cover my cost of operation. And we have that information here. You've already done the work to give you exactly what that's going to be for this coming year. So to find the information, we're going to start in the software. We're simply going to go into reports. And once in reports, I'm going to go down to the profit statement, the second report down. Now, by default, the profit statement sorts this report, and it shows in here, annual by P&L. And so what that does for you is it actually shows you and stacks up each department next to each other and then gives you a total for the company as a whole. So it's your month-by-month P&Ls from a cash flow perspective. I'm going to change that for this purpose, and I'm simply going to use the other option, the annual P&L by department. Now, what that's going to do is it simply gives me just the one department. So here I can see this is my annual P&L for the replacement department only. Remember, whatever is highlighted at the top is now what's going to show at the bottom. And so in this particular case, I've got my the actual dollar amount, I've got my percentage of income, and then we do have revenue per billable hour over there on the far right, which we really don't need for this exercise. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm simply going to see if we can make a little bit wiser use of our screen here, right? So I'm simply going to go down, and in here we've got our sales, we've got our cost of sales. Right underneath that, you're going to find gross profit. Now, in this particular case, that gross profit is $449,790. Now, that gross profit will cover all of the expenses, all the fixed overhead, all the variable overhead, enable me to pay my loans and generate a target net profit. So in this particular example here, that $449,000, if I scroll all the way to the bottom of this report, is going to generate $145,000 in net profit. Well, my gross margin, again, I don't want to include that net profit in that amount. I want to know, what is it going to cost me to run my company and generate the revenue I need to cover these particular expenses that we have in our fixed overhead, variable overhead, and loan payments. And so what we're going to do at that point is I'm going to come back up to the top, right, where we had our gross profit. And I'm simply going to tally up the items underneath that, right? So for example, variable overhead costs. Here's my variable expense total. I come over, that's $23,242. Go down a little bit farther, right? I've got my fixed overhead expenses. Fixed overhead, there's another $209,950. And then in my debt category, I've got another $70,720. And so those three categories, that's what it's costing me to run the company. I need cash in and day out to cover all of those expenses. So when I tally those three items up, that gives me a required gross margin before net profit of $303,912. Right? So then we also need to know, okay, how many days are we spreading that over? Now, for a typical year, there's about 240 working days per year. But let's be real, not all of those are productive working days. Right? If you don't have an install or a job that you're going to do or complete every single day, well, then it's not 240 hours, right? And in fact, if you base it on 240 days. If you base it on 240 days, and again, that simply comes from 5 days a week, spread across the entire year. But then, again, so you subtract out the weekends, you subtract out the holidays, and some typical vacation time in there as well. We don't have a full 240 working days. Right? So we're going to use a productivity ratio on there, right? And because again, this is going to assume if we use 240 that we have another install that we're going to do every single day of the week. And if we miss a day, then we're not going to cover all of our gross margin required. And so we use a productivity ratio in there. And I typically recommend a 65% productivity ratio in terms of jobs being completed or work being done every single day, right? So we're saying that 65% of those 240 days, we're going to have an install to do. All right, so if I take those 240 days times 0.65, that means we have 156 productive days. So 156 days where we're going to build in gross margin to make sure that we're covered. Now, think about it. Over the course of a week, right, if you look at 5 days times 0.65, you're looking at basically having jobs 3.25 days per week. If you happen to have 4 full days or 5, right, it's only an advantage. You're only going to be more profitable at that point in time. But in those 3.25 days per week, you're going to cover all of your gross margin for your company for the year, right? So that's the first step. We have 156 productive days here. So now I'm going to take that $303,912 gross margin dollars that I need just to cover my cost of operation, right? That's my required gross margin, and we're going to divide it by those 156 productive days. That'll give me my gross margin per man day. Okay, so at this point in time, I'm going to take that 303,000 divided by 156. My gross margin per man day is $1,948.16. So for every job I bid out, if it's a one-day job, doesn't matter if it's one guy or if it's 2 guys or 3 guys, right? I know that I need to add in $1,948 into that job to cover my cost of overhead to run the company. So I'm going to take all of my material costs, I'm going to take all of my gross margin, and then I'm going to put in my labor on top of that. And that's my cost on the job, and then I can add my net profit. Now, different pricing software does that a little bit differently in terms of whether you use just raw gross margin for overhead, fixed, variable, and debt. Others actually want you to include your net profit in that dollar amount as well. But you're going to calculate it the same way. And then from there, go ahead and enter it in your pricing software as you would enter it per their recommendations. So we hope you found that helpful. If you have any questions, reach out to us. We'd love to chat with you about it. And that is today's Planning for Profit Minute.